They thought they could embarrass her in front of everyone, but they had no idea they were about to expose their own arrogance the moment Amanda Johnson stepped through the glass doors of the dojo. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the polished wooden floor, and the faint smell of sweat and discipline lingered in the air. She moved quietly, almost unnoticed, in a simple gray hoodie and worn sneakers, her yellow belt tied neatly at her waist. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, and that was exactly why it drew the wrong kind of it. Brad Hoffman, the head instructor, stood near the center of the mat, arms crossed, his black belt draped like a badge of authority. His sharp eyes scanned her once, then dismissed her just as quickly. This wasn't unusual. People like him made judgments in seconds, deciding worth based on appearance, posture, even clothing you lost. He called out, his voice echoing just enough to pull the attention of the entire room. A few students paused mid-practice, others turned subtly, pretending not to stare. Amanda stopped a few feet from the mat, her posture relaxed, her voice calm. "I'm here for the afternoon session," a quiet response, but it only made things worse. A smirk crept across Brad's face as he exchanged a glance with another instructor. "This isn't a fitness class, lady," he said, his tone light, but edged with something sharper. A couple of students chuckled, not loudly, but enough, the kind of laughter that spreads quickly because no one wants to be the one left out. Amanda nodded once as if she'd heard it all before, because she stepped onto the mat anyway, the soft thud of her sneakers barely audible against the floor, and that's when the room shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that a few people noticed something they couldn't quite explain. Brad tilted his head, watching her more closely now. "Yellow belt, huh?" he said, circling her slowly as if evaluating a product he had no intention of buying. "We don't usually take beginners in this session." His words weren't loud, but they carried the kind of confidence that made others agree without question. Amanda didn't respond immediately. She simply adjusted the knot of her belt, her fingers steady, precise, a small detail, but one that didn't go unnoticed by the more experienced eyes in the room. "Maybe try the Tuesday night class," another instructor added with a grin. "Mostly beginners, slower pace." More laughter this time, a little louder. The air grew heavier, the kind that presses in on you when everyone is watching, waiting, expecting something. Amanda finally looked up, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm, almost detached, and for a brief moment something flickered across Brad's face, something like hesitation, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a confident smile. "Tell you what," he said, clapping his hands once as if sealing a decision. "We'll give you a quick demonstration, see where you stand." The students shifted, forming a loose circle, the unspoken rule of spectacle taking over the space. The dojo was no longer just a place to train, it had become a stage, and Amanda stood at the center of it. Without protest, without fear, without explanation, she stepped forward just one pace, and in that single movement something subtle but undeniable changed: the way she held her shoulders, the way her weight settled evenly, the way her breathing slowed, as if the noise around her no longer mattered. Brad noticed it, even if he didn't understand it, yet he took a step closer, his confidence still intact, but now sharpened by curiosity. "All right," he said, his voice lower, now more focused. "Let's see what you've got." And somewhere in the room someone stopped laughing, the kind of silence that follows when instinct tells you something isn't quite right, but no one can explain why. And in that quiet space, Amanda Johnson simply stood, waiting, as if she had been here before many times, as if this moment was not a challenge, but a choice, and the real question was never whether she could prove herself, it was whether they were ready to see it. Brad stepped onto the mat with measured confidence, his movements deliberate, designed to command attention rather than earn it. The circle around them tightened as students leaned in, some crossing their arms, others whispering quietly, the earlier laughter fading into a tense anticipation that filled every inch of the room. Amanda remained where she was, her feet grounded, her posture relaxed, but unmistakably balanced, her gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present. Brad rolled his shoulders once, as if preparing for something routine, something predictable. "We will keep this simple," he said, his voice carrying that same controlled authority, but now with a hint of curiosity underneath. "Just follow my lead, and try not to get overwhelmed." A few students nodded as if this outcome had already been decided. One of the instructors folded his arms with a faint smile, clearly expecting the same performance they had seen many times before. Amanda gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she understood the script they were trying to place her in, and had already chosen not to follow it. The room grew quieter. Still, even the sound of sneakers shifting against the mat seemed to fade. Brad took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes scanning her stance again, looking for signs of inexperience, something he could exploit, but what he saw did not match what he expected. Her shoulders were relaxed, her breathing slow, her weight evenly distributed, as if every part of her body knew exactly where it needed to be and why. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, too brief for most to notice, but enough for the atmosphere to shift again. "You can still step out if this feels like too much," he added, his tone softer now, but edged with something that sounded less like concern and more like control. Amanda finally spoke, her voice calm and even. "I am fine right here." There was no defiance in her words, no attempt to prove anything, and somehow that made them land heavier than any argument could. Brad let out a short breath, then moved first, not aggressively, but with the kind of confidence that assumes cooperation. His motion was clean, practiced, familiar to everyone watching, and yet before anyone could fully register what happened, Amanda shifted just slightly, not a dramatic movement, not something that demanded attention, but something precise, something intentional. His approach met empty space where she had been a moment before, and he stopped, adjusting quickly, as if correcting a minor miscalculation. A few students exchanged glances, unsure of what they had just seen. "Again," Brad said quickly, brushing it off, his tone tightening as he reset his position. This time, he moved with more focus, more intent, but the result was the same. Amanda responded with minimal effort, her movement efficient, almost effortless, as if she was not reacting, but simply allowing his momentum to pass. Without resistance, the circle grew silent, completely silent. Now no whispers, no laughter, only the soft rhythm of controlled breathing and the faint sound of fabric shifting with each movement. Brad's confidence began to show cracks, not obvious, not yet, but present, in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his eyes narrowed, trying to understand what was happening in front of him. This was not how it was supposed to go. Amanda remained composed, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had stepped outside the tension entirely and was observing it from a distance. One of the younger students near the edge of the circle leaned forward slightly, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by something closer to confusion or maybe recognition. Another instructor uncrossed his arms without realizing it, his attention fully locked on the exchange. "Where did you train?" Brad asked, suddenly, his voice lower, now more controlled, but carrying a trace of something new, something uncertain. Amanda did not answer right away. She simply adjusted her stance again, the same small, deliberate motion that seemed insignificant until it was not. "Different places," she said finally, her tone neutral, offering nothing more and nothing less than the truth. Brad exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in around him. The demonstration he had intended was no longer his to control, and somewhere deep down, he began to realize that the situation had already shifted beyond his understanding. But pride has a way of delaying recognition, and as he straightened his posture, preparing to try again, the room held its breath, not in anticipation of what he would do, but in quiet awareness that whatever came next would not unfold the way he expected. And Amanda Johnson stood there, calm, steady, and entirely unshaken, as if she had been waiting for this moment, not to prove anything to them, but to let them reveal everything to themselves. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the dojo, like something alive, pressing into every corner, every breath, every thought. Brad adjusted his stance again, but this time, it was different, less about performance, more about control. He could feel it slipping, not dramatically, not in a way that others could easily name, but enough to unsettle him. His voice, when he spoke again, carried less certainty. "You are holding back," he said, watching Amanda carefully, as if the answer might reveal itself in the way she stood, in the way she breathed. Amanda tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, as if she had heard this before many times. "I am matching what is in front of me," she replied softly, and the words landed heavier than anyone expected. A few students shifted uncomfortably, one of them glanced at the others, searching for reassurance that this was still normal, still part of the routine, but no one offered it. Brad let out a short laugh, though it lacked the sharp edge it once had. "Then do not match it," he said, stepping forward again. "Show me what you actually know." There was a challenge in his tone now, but also something else, something closer to insistence, as if he needed to prove that this situation still belonged to him. Amanda did not move right away. She stood still for a brief moment, her eyes steady, her presence calm. And in that pause, something changed, not in her, but In the room, the air seemed to shift as if everyone sensed that the next moment would not be like the ones before. She stepped forward just enough to close the distance, her movement smooth, controlled, without urgency, and Brad reacted quickly this time, more focused, more deliberate, but again his motion met something he could not fully predict, not resistance, not force, but precision. Amanda redirected his approach with minimal effort, her hands guiding rather than stopping, her timing exact, her awareness complete. And in that instant, it became clear to those watching that this was not improvisation. This was experience built over years, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it reveals itself through control. Brad stepped back, resetting once more, but now the confidence in his posture had changed. It was still there, but it was no longer effortless. It was maintained, held together by habit rather than certainty. "Where did you learn that?" one of the instructors asked from the edge of the circle, his voice quieter than before, no longer amused. Amanda glanced briefly in his direction, then back to Brad. "From people who did not need to prove anything," she answered, and again the simplicity of her words carried more weight than any explanation could. The younger student, who had been watching closely, lowered his arms, his expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper, something like realization. He was beginning to see what others were still trying to deny. Brad inhaled slowly, the room watching him, now waiting for his next move. And he knew it. This was no longer about teaching or demonstrating. It was about reclaiming something he felt slipping away. "One more time," he said, his voice firm, though the edge of certainty was thinner now. Amanda nodded once, her posture unchanged, her presence unwavering, as if she had already accepted whatever came next, not as a challenge, but as a continuation. Brad moved again, this time with full intention, no hesitation, no attempt to simplify. And yet the outcome did not change. Amanda responded with the same calm precision, her movements efficient, her control undeniable. And as the moment settled, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a beginner. This was not someone out of place. This was someone who had been underestimated from the moment she walked in, and the room knew it now, not through explanation, not through claims, but through what they had just witnessed. No one spoke, no one laughed, no one moved. The energy that once fed on judgment had collapsed into something else entirely, something quieter, something heavier, and in the center of it, Amanda Johnson stood exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, steady, and untouched by the noise around her, as if the entire moment had never been about proving who she was, but about revealing who they were all along. The weight of the silence did not lift, it settled deeper, turning the dojo into something unfamiliar, something stripped of its earlier confidence. Brad did not move right away, and that alone was enough for everyone to notice the shift, because he was not the kind of man who paused without reason. His jaw tightened slightly as his eyes remained fixed on Amanda, searching not for weakness anymore, but for understanding. And that was the moment the balance truly changed, not when she moved, not when she responded, but when he stopped assuming. He already knew Amanda stood exactly where she had been, her breathing, even her posture unchanged, as if none of this had required effort, as if this entire exchange existed on a level she had already mastered long before stepping into this room. One of the instructors near the edge cleared his throat softly, the sound small, but loud enough in the silence to draw attention. "Brad," he said carefully, not interrupting, but not fully silent either. "Maybe we should." He did not finish the sentence because he did not need to. The implication hung in the air, suggesting that perhaps this had gone far enough, that perhaps the demonstration had already revealed more than intended. But Brad did not look away from Amanda. "No," he said quietly, the word controlled but firm. "We are not done." There was something different in his tone, now not arrogance, not mockery, but something closer to pride struggling to hold its ground. Amanda did not react to his words. She simply waited, her stillness no longer passive, but deliberate, as if she was allowing him the space to reach whatever conclusion he needed to reach on his own. A few students exchanged uncertain glances. The energy that once encouraged them to watch now made them hesitant, as if they were witnessing something more personal than they had expected, something that no longer felt like entertainment. The younger student, who had leaned forward earlier, now stood completely still, his eyes fixed on Amanda, his expression no longer confused but attentive, absorbing every detail, every movement, every pause. Brad took a slow breath, then stepped closer again, but this time there was no performance in it, no exaggerated confidence, no attempt to impress the room. His focus had narrowed completely onto the person in front of him. You could have said something, he said, his voice lower, now carrying a trace of something unfamiliar, something almost reflective. Amanda met his gaze without hesitation. Would it have changed anything? She asked the question, simple, direct, and impossible to dismiss. Brad did not answer immediately, because he knew the truth. He had already made his decision the moment she walked in, and nothing she could have said would have altered it. The room seemed to hold that realization with him, the quiet growing heavier as it settled over everyone present. Another instructor shifted his stance, looking away briefly, as if uncomfortable with what was being revealed, not about Amanda, but about themselves. Brad exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be noticeable again. He said, but this time the word carried no challenge, no attempt to dominate. It sounded almost like a request. Amanda gave a small nod, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she understood what this moment had become. Brad moved forward once more, but now his approach was measured, respectful, stripped of the assumptions that had defined him only minutes before. Amanda responded in kind, her movements still precise, still controlled, but now matched by a different energy, not defensive, not reactive, but collaborative, as if the exchange had shifted from demonstration to understanding. The circle around them did not move. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt, because what they were witnessing was no longer about skill alone. It was about something deeper, something quieter, something that could not be taught through words. When the movement ended, Brad stepped back, and this time, he did not immediately reset. He stood there looking at Amanda, not as a challenge, not as a problem to solve, but as something he had misjudged entirely. The realization settled across his face, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. You are not new, he said finally. Amanda's expression softened just slightly, not in pride, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement. No, she replied, and that single word carried the weight of everything they had failed to see. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of recognition, the kind that comes when something has been revealed that cannot be taken back. And in the center of it, Amanda Johnson stood calm, steady, and unchanged, while everything around her had quietly begun to shift. No one moved for several seconds after her answer settled into the room. It was not dramatic, it was not loud, but it carried a finality that no one could ignore. Brad looked around, briefly, not in confusion, but in quiet awareness that every eye in the dojo was now on him, waiting not for dominance, but for response, and that distinction mattered more than anything he had faced before. His reputation, his authority, everything he had built in this space had always relied on certainty, on being the one who defined the standard. But standing across from Amanda, he could feel that standard shifting, not because it had been challenged loudly, but because it had been revealed quietly. One of the senior instructors took a slow step forward, his voice careful, measured. Where did you train? He asked again, but this time there was no hint of doubt, no trace of mockery, only genuine curiosity. Amanda glanced at him briefly, then back at Brad, as if acknowledging the question, but choosing not to make it the focus. A long time ago, she said simply, and the answer felt incomplete, but intentional, as if the details were not what mattered. Brad nodded slowly, absorbing that response, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance of something he could no longer deny. You should have said something when you walked in, he said again, softer now, less like an accusation, and more like reflection. Amanda's gaze remained steady. You already decided who I was, she replied, and this time no one in the room could look away from that truth. It did not echo, it did not need to, it landed, and stayed. One of the younger students shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his own belt, as if questioning what it actually represented. Another instructor exhaled quietly, the earlier tension replaced by something heavier, something closer to humility. Brad ran a hand along the edge of his belt, not adjusting it, but feeling it, as if for the first time it meant something different than it had just minutes before. This place, he began, his voice slower, now deliberate. We teach discipline, we teach respect. He paused briefly, then added, at least that is what we say. Amanda listened without interruption, her expression calm, but attentive. Respect is not something you say, she responded. It is something you show, especially when you think someone does not deserve it. The room absorbed her words in silence, not the tense silence from before, but a quieter, more reflective one, the kind that leaves no room for deflection. Brad let out a breath he had been holding longer than he realized, and for a moment the weight of the room shifted completely, not away from him, but through him, as if he was no longer standing above it, but within it. Stay, he said finally, the words simple, but carrying more meaning than anything he had said all afternoon. Train here. Amanda tilted her head slightly, considering not the offer itself, but what it represented, not an invitation to prove herself, but an acknowledgement that she already had. She looked around the dojo, briefly taking in the faces, the space, the atmosphere that had changed without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. Then she returned her gaze to Brad. "I did not come here to prove anything," she said, her voice steady. "I came here because I thought this was a place where people trained without assumptions." The words did not accuse, they clarified, and that made them harder to dismiss. Brad nodded once slowly, understanding that the decision in front of him was no longer about her. It was about whether this place could become what it claimed to be. The students remained silent, watching, not for conflict, but for resolution, for something that would define what this moment meant. Amanda stepped back, slightly, giving space, not retreating, not withdrawing, but allowing the room to breathe again. And in that movement, something subtle shifted once more, not in her but in everyone else. The need to judge, to categorize, to assume began to fade, replaced by something quieter, something more honest. And as the light from the high windows stretched further across the mat, casting long reflections across the floor, the dojo no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a place where something had been stripped away and something more real had taken its place. And in the center of it, Amanda Johnson stood exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, steady, and entirely unchanged. While the world around her had finally begun to catch up, the room did not return to what it had been before, and that was the first thing everyone felt, even if no one said it out loud. The usual rhythm of the dojo, the light chatter, the casual confidence, the unspoken hierarchy had all been interrupted by something quieter, but far more powerful. Brad stepped back fully, this time no longer positioning himself as the center of attention, but as part of the space itself, and that alone changed how everyone saw him. He looked at Amanda again, not searching, not measuring, but acknowledging, and that shift did not go unnoticed by the others. One of the instructors, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "We should reset the class," he suggested, not as an order, but as a way forward. Brad nodded once, then turned slightly toward the group. "Everyone back to position," he said, but his tone was different. No sharp edge, no command for obedience, just a clear direction. The students moved quickly, but without the earlier energy of performance. There was a new awareness in their steps, a new quiet focus as they returned to their places. Amanda remained where she was for a moment longer, observing, not judging, not evaluating, just present, as if she was allowing the room to settle on its own terms. The younger student, who had been watching closely, approached her slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by something more respectful. "How long have you been training?" he asked, his voice careful, as if he did not want to repeat the mistake others had made. Amanda looked at him for a brief second, then offered a small answer. "Long enough to know that it never really ends." The student nodded, absorbing that response as if it meant more than the question itself. He stepped back, returning to his place, but his posture had changed, no longer casual, no longer careless. Brad walked toward the center again, but this time he did not stand above the group. He stood with them, his presence still strong, but no longer dominant. "We start with fundamentals," he said, glancing briefly at Amanda before addressing everyone. "Everyone follows the same pace." There was no exception in his words, no distinction made, and that was understood by all. Amanda stepped into line, without hesitation, blending into the group, as if she had always been there. The exercises began, simple, controlled movements repeated in rhythm, the sound of feet against the mat returning, but now steadier, more deliberate. Brad moved through the rows, offering guidance, correcting posture, adjusting positioning, but there was something different in the way he interacted. He watched more closely, he listened more carefully, and when he reached Amanda, he did not correct her, he did not instruct her, he simply paused for a second, then moved on, and that pause said everything. The instructors exchanged subtle glances, not of confusion but of recognition. They had all felt it, the shift in tone, the shift in purpose, the shift in what this place was meant to represent. As the session continued, the earlier tension dissolved completely, replaced by a quiet intensity that felt earned, not forced. Amanda moved with the group, her motions precise, her presence grounded, but she did not stand out, and that was the most striking part of all. She did not need to stand out, because what she carried did not depend on being seen. It existed regardless of who noticed. As the final sequence came to an end, Brad called for stillness, and the room obeyed instantly. But this time the silence was not heavy, it was steady, it felt complete. Brad looked across the group, his gaze moving from one student to the next before settling briefly on Amanda, then continuing, as if she was simply part of the whole. "What you saw today," he said slowly, was not about skill alone. He paused, allowing the words to settle. It was about assumption and what it costs when you let it lead you. No one responded. No one needed to. The message had already taken root. Amanda stood quietly among them, her expression unchanged, her presence as steady as it had been from the beginning, and as the light outside began to dim, casting softer shadows across the mat, the dojo felt different, not because of what had happened, but because of what had been understood, and in that understanding something new had begun to take shape, something that could not be undone and did not need to be announced. The class did not end. When the final movement stopped, it lingered in the air, carried in the way. Everyone stood a little straighter, a little quieter, as if something invisible had reset the rhythm of the room. Brad lowered his hands slowly, signaling the close of the session. But no one rushed to leave as they usually did. Instead, students remained in place, exchanging fewer words than before, each of them replaying the same moment in their minds, the moment when certainty had shifted. Without warning, Amanda stepped back from the line, her movements unhurried as she reached for her hoodie, folding it over her arm with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the entire session. She did not look around for approval. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She simply prepared to leave, as if this had been nothing more than a regular afternoon for her. But to everyone else it was anything. But the younger student approached again, this time more confident, but still careful. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet hope. Amanda paused for a brief second, then gave a small nod. "If the training stays honest," she said, and the answer lingered in the space between them. The student nodded quickly, as if he understood, even if he could not fully explain why. Brad watched from a few steps away, his arms no longer crossed, his posture open, his expression thoughtful. He walked toward her, stopping at a respectful distance, not too close, not too far. "I misjudged you," he said directly, no hesitation, no excuse. Amanda met his gaze without tension. "You judged what you saw," she replied. "Most people do." Brad exhaled slowly, accepting the truth in her words. "That is not what we are supposed to teach here," he said, more to himself than to her. Amanda tilted her head slightly. "Then teach something different," she answered simply, and with that she turned, stepping toward the exit, the soft sound of her footsteps echoing lightly against the floor as she moved through the quiet room. No one stopped her, no one called out. They simply watched, not because they needed to see more, but because they were trying to understand what they had already seen. As the door opened, a brief rush of cool evening air slipped inside, carrying with it the fading light of the day. Amanda stepped through without looking back, and the door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the dojo in a silence that felt completely different from the one before. Brad remained standing in the center of the room for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the space she had just left, as if something in that direction still held his attention. One of the instructors walked up beside him, crossing his arms again, but this time without the earlier confidence. "You think she will come back?" he asked quietly. Brad did not answer immediately. He looked around the room, at the students, at the space, at the place he had believed he fully understood just hours ago. "That depends," he said finally, "on whether this place becomes worth coming back to." The instructor nodded slowly, understanding that the answer had nothing to do with her and everything to do with them. The students began to gather their things more quietly than usual. No loud conversations, no careless laughter, just a steady movement toward the exit, each person carrying something unseen but undeniable. As the lights overhead flickered on, casting a softer glow across the mat, the dojo felt less like a stage and more like a place that had been given a second chance, not by force, not by instruction, but by a moment that could not be ignored. Brad walked toward the edge of the mat and looked down at the lines that marked the training space, lines he had walked across countless times without thinking, but now they seemed different, not because they had changed, but because he adjusted his belt once, not out of habit, but with intention. Then looked up again, the room now nearly empty, the silence no longer heavy, but clear, and in that quiet clarity, one thing remained certain: the next time someone walked through those doors, they would not be seen the same way, and neither would he. The dojo felt different the next morning, not because the space had changed, but because the people inside it had. Brad arrived earlier than usual, the quiet hum of the building greeting him as he unlocked the doors and stepped onto the mat alone for the first time in a long while. He did not move right away. He simply stood there, looking across the room, as if seeing it from a distance, instead of from the center of control. The lines on the mat, the mirrors along the wall, the place where he had stood so many times with certainty, all of it looked the same, but felt Unfamiliar in a way he could not ignore, he walked slowly across the floor, his footsteps softer than usual, as if he was careful not to disturb something that had finally settled. He adjusted the lights, then paused near the center of the mat, his hands resting at his sides, his posture no longer rigid, just present. The memory of the previous day did not replay as a moment of challenge, it returned as a moment of clarity, the kind that does not ask for attention but demands reflection. One by one, the students began to arrive, their voices lower than usual, their movements more intentional as they stepped inside. There were no loud greetings, no careless energy, just quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that something had shifted, even if no one had said it out loud. The younger student entered and glanced briefly at the center of the mat, before taking his place, his posture straighter, his focus sharper, as if he had made a decision without needing to announce it. The instructors followed, each carrying their own version of the same realization. Some avoided eye contact at first, others nodded subtly toward Brad, as if recognizing a change they did not yet know how to name. When the class gathered, Brad did not immediately begin. He looked across the group, taking in each face, not scanning for mistakes, not measuring skill, but observing with a level of attention he had not shown before. "We start the same way," he said finally, his voice calm, steady. "But we do not start the same as yesterday." The words were simple, but they carried weight because everyone understood what he meant. The warm-up began, controlled movements repeated with focus, but something about it felt different. There was less urgency to impress, more intention to understand. Brad moved through the group, offering guidance, but now he listened as much as he spoke, adjusting not only posture but approach. And when a student struggled, he did not correct with authority, he guided with patience, and the difference was visible not in dramatic ways, but in small details, the kind that accumulate over time. The door opened quietly halfway through the session, and for a brief moment no one looked, but they all felt it. Amanda stepped inside, her presence as calm as it had been the day before. She did not announce herself, she did not seek attention, she simply moved to the edge of the mat, removing her hoodie and stepping into line, as if she had always been part of the group. Brad noticed her, but did not stop the class. He did not call her out, he did not shift the focus, he simply acknowledged her presence with a brief nod and continued, and that single choice changed everything. It told the room that she did not need to be singled out to be respected, she did not need to be tested to be accepted, she was simply there, and that was enough. The students felt it, the instructors saw it, and the energy of the room adjusted naturally, as if aligning with something more stable, more honest. The session continued, the rhythm steady, the movements precise. Amanda trained alongside them, not leading, not following, just present, her skill evident, but never displayed, her control clear, but never emphasized, and in that quiet consistency something deeper took hold. The idea that strength did not need to be proven, that respect did not need to be demanded, that both could exist without being announced. As the class came to a close, Brad called for stillness, and the room responded instantly. The silence that followed was not heavy, it was grounded, it felt earned. Brad looked across the group, his gaze steady, his voice measured. "What you bring into this room matters," he said, "but what you leave behind matters more." He paused briefly, then added, "Assumptions stay outside." No one spoke, no one needed to. Amanda stood among them, her expression unchanged, her presence steady as the light from the morning stretched across the floor, and in that quiet moment the dojo was no longer a place defined by hierarchy or expectation. It had become something else, something that could only exist when people chose to see beyond what was in front of them. And as the class ended and the students began to move again, one thing remained certain: the lesson had not been taught, it had been revealed, and no one in that room would forget it. The days that followed did not bring applause or dramatic recognition, they brought something quieter, something far more lasting, the kind of change that settles into a place and reshapes it without needing to be announced. Amanda continued to arrive, without pattern, sometimes early, sometimes just as the session began, always the same in presence, calm, steady, unassuming, and each time she stepped onto the mat, she did not stand apart. She stood among them, moving through drills with the same precision, the same quiet awareness that had first unsettled the room, but now grounded it. The students no longer watched her with curiosity, they trained beside her with focused learning, not by asking who she was, but by observing how she moved, how she listened, how she responded, without excess, without ego. The younger student, who had once asked simple questions, now trained with a different kind of discipline, his movements sharper, his attention deeper, as if he had realized that progress was not about being seen, but about being consistent. Brad changed, as well, though not in ways that demanded attention. He spoke less and observed more. His corrections became fewer but more precise, his tone steady without the edge it once carried. And when new students walked through the door, he did not measure them in a single glance. He gave them space to reveal themselves on their own terms. One afternoon, a new visitor stepped inside, hesitant, unsure, her posture uncertain, her clothing simple and worn, and for a brief moment the room paused, not visibly, not dramatically, but just enough to remember what it used to do. Brad noticed it, the instinct to judge, the habit to assume, and he stepped forward, not to challenge, not to test, but to welcome. "You are in the right place," he said simply, and that single sentence changed everything. Amanda stood nearby, not intervening, not guiding, just present, and in that presence there was a quiet confirmation that the lesson had not been temporary. It had taken root. The class continued, the rhythm steady, the energy balanced, no longer driven by hierarchy, but by shared intention. And as the light from the late afternoon filtered through the windows, casting long lines across the mat, the dojo felt complete, not perfect, but honest, a place where strength was no longer measured by what was displayed, but by what was understood. At the end of the session, Brad called for stillness, and the room responded instantly. The silence that followed was not heavy, it was clear. It held no tension, no expectation, just a quiet sense of alignment. He looked across the group, his gaze steady, his voice calm. "You will meet people who do not look the way you expect," he said slowly. "Do not make the mistake of deciding who they are before they show you." No one spoke. The words did not require response. They settled into the room, becoming part of it. Amanda stood among them, her expression unchanged, her presence as steady as it had been from the beginning. And as the session ended, she stepped away, quietly retrieving her hoodie and moving toward the door, just as she always did. No